There is a sound that exists only on water at night. It is not the crash of waves against a shore, nor the cry of gulls, nor the wind in the rigging. It is something smaller, more intimate. It is the sound of oars, dipping and rising, each stroke a whisper of wood against water, a conversation between a vessel and the deep. Imagine that sound. Imagine it on a moonless night in the summer of 1818. The place is the Swiss shore of Lake Geneva, near the village of Cologne. The water is black as ink, reflecting nothing. A small boat moves across that darkness, carrying a single passenger. He is young, perhaps not yet 30. His hair is dark, his eyes are pale and restless, and in his hands he holds a leather portfolio stuffed with papers, poems, letters, the fragments of a life he is about to leave behind. He has told his companions he is going for a late sail, a whim, a poet's fancy. They have waved him off from the shore, their lanterns small points of light in the gathering dark. They do not know that they are watching him disappear. They do not know that he has planned this for months. His name is Percy Bysshe Shelley, and by dawn the world will believe he is dead. But the world, as it so often does, will believe a story that is not quite true. The boat will be found, overturned, drifting near the French shore. His clothes will wash up on the rocks. A volume of Keats, waterlogged and swollen, will be recovered from the wreckage. There will be mourning, there will be elegies, there will be a funeral. And somewhere, in a city far from the lake, a man will read his own obituary and smile. This is the story of a poet who vanished, of a death that was not a death, of a man who loved fame but feared its cost more. It is a story of debt, of scandal, of a heart that could not bear the weight of its own brilliance. It is a story that asks a question as old as storytelling itself. If you could leave everything behind, your name, your reputation, your very identity, and begin again, would you? The answer for one man was yes. But the price of that answer was a silence that would last for 40 years. A silence filled with secrets, with lies, with the slow, patient work of watching your own legend grow from beyond the grave. So draw close to the fire, let the wind stir the curtains, let the candles burn low, and keep them lit. For the story we are about to trace is written in invisible ink, and the man who wrote it is waiting, in the shadows between the lines, to be found. Before there was a disappearance, there was a life, and before there was a legend, there was a man. His name was Percy Bysshe Shelley, and by the spring of 1818, he had already lived several lives. He had been the heir to a fortune, the radical pamphleteer, the eloping lover, the disowned son, the bereaved father, the celebrated poet, the public scandal. He had been, in his 25 years, more things than most men are in a lifetime, and he was exhausted by all of them. To understand why a man would choose to become a ghost, you must first understand the weight of being seen. Shelley in 1818 was not the ethereal figure of legend, the delicate spirit of Victorian imagination. He was a creature of flesh and nerve, tall and stooped, with hair that fell across a forehead permanently furrowed by thought. His eyes, when they fixed upon you, were pale and unsettling, the eyes of a man who saw through surfaces, who read the hidden text beneath the visible world. Those eyes had seen too much. They had seen his first wife, Harriet, float to the surface of the Serpentine in Hyde Park, pregnant with another man's child, driven by despair or madness or both. They had seen his children by her taken from him by the courts, declared unfit for his custody, his atheism, his immorality. They had seen the reviews that called him a monster, a degenerate, a corrupter of youth. In 1814, he had abandoned Harriet for Mary Godwin, the daughter of the radical philosopher William Godwin and the feminist Mary Wollstonecraft. It was a love that consumed him, that lifted him to heights of joy and plunged him into depths of public scorn. They had fled to Europe together, living on borrowed money and borrowed time. They had married after Harriet's death, but the stain of scandal never washed clean. By 1818, they were in Italy, fleeing England as much for their health as for their peace. Shelley's own health was a whisper of mortality that never left his side. He coughed blood into his handkerchief and hid the evidence. He felt the weight in his chest, the flutter of a heart that beat too fast, too irregularly, as if it were practicing for its own cessation. And the money, always the money. His father, Sir Timothy Shelley, had cut him off. The family fortune, which should have been his, was withheld, doled out in grudging increments through lawyers and intermediaries. Creditors circled like wolves. Letters arrived daily, each one a demand, a threat, a reminder that the world would have its due. In the midst of this, he wrote. He wrote Prometheus Unbound. He wrote Julian and Madelot. He wrote poems that would become the bedrock of English Romanticism. But in 1818, no one knew this. They knew only the scandal. They knew only the man who had left his wife, who had abandoned his children, who had written blasphemy and called it poetry. There is a moment in every life when the walls press too close, when the weight of being oneself becomes unbearable, when the name you carry, the name you were given, the name that should be a banner becomes instead a burden. For Shelley, that moment came in the spring of 1818. He was in Bagni di Lucca, a spa town in the Tuscan hills, with Mary and their surviving child, Clara. The air was sweet with cypress and myrtle. The mountains rose in blue distances. It should have been a place of peace. But Clara was sick. She was dying, in fact, though they did not know it yet. Mary was exhausted, stretched thin by grief and motherhood and the constant, grinding anxiety of their existence. And Shelley sat at his desk, staring at a letter from his publisher that told him his latest work had sold fewer than 50 copies. He folded the letter. He placed it in a drawer. He walked to the window and looked out at the mountains, and for a long moment he did not see them. He saw nothing. He was, for that moment, already a ghost. The thought came to him not as a decision, but as a question, a whisper from some deep chamber of his mind. What if you simply stopped? Not death. He did not want death. He wanted the cessation of the name. He wanted to shed the skin of Percy Bysshe Shelley like a snake sheds its outgrown self, leaving it behind for the world to find and wonder at. What if they found his boat overturned? What if they found his clothes waterlogged on a foreign shore? What if they mourned him, elegized him, made of his flawed, exhausted life a beautiful fiction? And what if, somewhere far away, a man with a different name sat in a quiet room and finally, for the first time in his life, breathed? The question hung in the air like smoke. He did not answer it, not yet. But he did not dismiss it, either. He kept it folded in the same drawer where he had placed the letter from his publisher. A secret possibility, a door in the wall that he had not yet opened, but whose existence he now acknowledged. And somewhere, far to the north, on the shores of a lake he had known in another life, the waters waited. The verifiable fact of this chapter: in June of 1818, Shelley wrote to his friend Thomas Love Peacock from Bagni di Lucca, describing his health as considerably improved and mentioning a new boat he had commissioned. He did not mention the cough. He did not mention the blood. He did not mention the door in the wall. But the door was there, and soon he would find the key. Keep the candle lit. The wind carries us now from the dry heat of Tuscany to the cool, electric air of the Swiss Alps. We go backward in time to the summer of 1816, the year without a summer. The volcano had spoken half a world away. Mount Tambora in the Dutch East Indies had erupted with a force that dimmed the sun and chilled the earth. Crops failed. Snow fell in July. And in a villa on the shores of Lake Geneva, a group of young English exiles gathered to wait out the endless rain. The Villa Diodati, even the name sounds like a poem. It stood on a hill above the lake, its windows facing the water and the mountains beyond. Lord Byron had taken it for the summer, a handsome young man with a clubfoot and a genius for scandal. With him came his physician, John Polidori, a young man of ambition and insecurity. And nearby, in a smaller lodging, lived the Godwins, Mary, her stepsister Claire Claremont, and Percy Bysshe Shelley. Claire had orchestrated the proximity. She was in love with Byron, or thought she was, and had followed him to Switzerland with a determination that bordered on obsession. But it was Mary and Shelley who would take the true gift from that summer. They gathered in the villa's salon evening after evening. The fire crackled. The rain beat against the windows. Byron, restless and brilliant, would read aloud from German ghost stories. The flames cast his shadow large against the wall. "Let us each write a ghost story," he said one night. Mary, 18 years old, sat apart. She listened, she thought, and in the small hours of the night, after the others had gone to bed, a vision came to her. A pale student of unhallowed arts, the creature he made, the horror of it. She wrote it down. She called it Frankenstein. But it was another story, told on another night, that concerns us here. Byron, as he often did, spoke of his own life, of the scandals that had driven him from England, of the debts, the affairs, the enemies who hounded him, and he told a tale of a man he had known, a gentleman of his acquaintance, who had found himself so beset by creditors and obligations that he had simply vanished. Not died, vanished. He had staged a drowning, Byron said, left his clothes on a beach, sailed out in a small boat and never returned. The world had mourned him, buried an empty coffin, and moved on. Meanwhile, the man had made his way to America, where he lived out his days under a borrowed name, free at last of the weight of being himself. Shelley listened. He sat in the corner of the salon, half in shadow, his pale eyes reflecting the firelight. He did not speak, he did not ask questions, but he listened and he remembered. Mary, bent over her writing, did not look up, but later, in her journal, she would record the evening. Byron told us a strange tale of a man who escaped his life through water. Shelley seemed most affected by it. The verifiable fact of this chapter, the summer of 1816, was indeed the year without a summer, caused by the eruption of Mount Tambora in April 1815, the most powerful volcanic eruption in recorded human history. The global cooling that followed created the conditions for those endless, stormy nights at the Villa Diodati. And in those conditions, two of the most enduring myths of the Romantic era were born: the monster of Frankenstein and the possibility of vanishing. Shelley returned to that possibility in the months and years that followed. He turned it over in his mind like a smooth stone, feeling its weight, its texture, its potential. It was not a plan, not yet. It was a seed. And seeds, given the right conditions, will grow. The summer ended. The storms passed. The party scattered, Byron to Italy, the Shelleys back to England, Polidori to his sad, brief fate. But the seed remained, buried in the soil of Shelley's consciousness, waiting for the season of its germination. By 1818, that season had come. Keep the candle lit. Let us sit with him now, in the quiet of his room. The year is 1818. The place is a rented house in Est, near Venice. Shelley is 26 years old, but he looks older. The lines around his eyes are too deep. The pallor of his skin is too pronounced. He moves through the rooms like a man walking underwater. His daughter, Clara, is dead. She died in Venice just months ago. They had rushed her to a physician, but it was too late. The fever had taken her. Mary is shattered, a ghost herself, moving through the days with eyes that see nothing. Shelley holds her at night, feeling the sobs that shake her frame, unable to offer any comfort that matters. And still, the letters come. From London, from his publisher. His new work is not selling. The reviews are cruel. One calls him a man of undoubted genius but doubtful morality. Another suggests that his writings should be burned and himself with them. He folds the letters and places them in a drawer. He has stopped showing them to Mary. She has enough to carry. His health worsens. The cough returns, each attack leaving him weak and breathless. He diagnoses himself as he always does, a passing ailment, the cost of a damp climate, but in his private moments he wonders. He has seen consumption take others. He knows the signs. He thinks of his mother, who died young, of his sisters, lost to him now, their letters unanswered, of Harriet, her body rising from the water, her eyes open to the sky she could no longer see. And he thinks of the story Byron told 2 summers ago, the man who vanished, the man who escaped. The seed is growing. He begins to write less. The poems that had once poured from him now come in fragments, lines that refuse to cohere, images that dissolve before he can capture them. He tells himself it is grief, exhaustion, the pressure of circumstance. But a part of him knows the truth. He is saving himself, conserving something, preparing. In his letters from this period, the ones that survive, there is a new note, a distance, a vagueness. He writes to his friend Peacock of the Italian landscape, the quality of the light, the kindness of the people. He does not write of his cough, his debts, his despair. He is already beginning to disappear. The verifiable fact of this chapter: in September 1818, Shelley's daughter Clara died in Venice at the age of 1. The death certificate, filed with the British consulate, records the cause as dysentery. But those who were there, Mary, Claire, the servants, knew it was more complicated. It was the fever, yes, but it was also the exhaustion, the constant movement, the inability to find rest in a world that would not let them rest. After Clara's death, something shifted in Shelley. Mary noticed it. She wrote in her journal, "He is gentler now, but also farther away, as if he is standing on the other side of a river and the current between us grows stronger every day." She did not know how true her words would become. He began to spend more time alone, long walks along the canal, returning after dark, hours sitting in the garden, staring at nothing. When she asked what he was thinking, he would smile and say, "Nothing, only the sound of the water." The water! It was always there in his thoughts now. The water of Lake Geneva, dark and deep. The water of the canal, flowing past their door. The water that had taken Harriet, that had closed over her head and held her in its cold embrace. Water could be an ending, but water could also be a beginning. He thought of the man in Byron's story. Had he felt this way in the days before his disappearance? Had he walked through his life like a ghost already, rehearsing for the moment when the ghost would become real? Shelley did not know, but he knew one thing: the name he carried was killing him. Not slowly, not gently, but with the relentless pressure of a weight too heavy for any man to bear. Percy Bysshe Shelley. The name was a target, a brand, a sentence. It marked him for the world's judgment, for its cruelty, for its endless, grinding demand that he be what they expected or pay the price. What if he simply stopped being him? What if the name died and the man lived? The question was no longer a seed. It was a tree, casting its shadow over everything he did. And in the spring of 1818, on the shores of Lake Geneva, he would finally step into that shadow. Keep the candle lit. To vanish is an art. It requires preparation, patience, a mind that can hold multiple truths at once. It requires the ability to look at the people you love and see them from the other side of a distance they cannot cross. Shelley, in the months before his disappearance, became a master of this art. He began with the boat. In the spring of 1818, while still in Italy, he commissioned a small sailing vessel. He called it the Don Juan, after Byron's scandalous poem. It was a joke, a provocation, a gesture of solidarity with his friend, but it was also something else, a tool. He wrote to the builder with precise specifications. The hull must be light, he said, but sturdy. The sails must be easily managed by a single man. He spoke of exploring the Italian lakes, of the pleasure of solitary sailing. The builder saw no reason to doubt him. The boat was delivered in May. Shelley took it out alone, day after day, learning its habits, its moods, its responses to wind and current. He sailed farther each time, testing its limits, testing his own. Mary watched from the shore, a small figure in a blue dress, waving as he disappeared around a bend in the lake. She did not know she was watching him rehearse. He made other preparations. Letters began to arrive at the house, addressed not to Shelley, but to a name no one recognized, John Williams. Shelley explained them away as a mistake, a confusion of postal services, but he kept them, reading them in private, burning some, filing others. In his desk drawer, a small stack of coins accumulated, not English currency, but French, Swiss, Italian, the currency of a man who might need to move quickly across borders. He grew a beard. Mary teased him about it, saying he looked like a brigand. He laughed and said nothing, but at night he would stand before the mirror, studying the face that was slowly becoming someone else's. The beard changed him. It softened the sharp lines of his jaw, obscured the sensitive mouth that critics had called effeminate. It made him look older, harder, more like the world's idea of a man. It made him look less like Percy Bysshe Shelley. He began to write less. The poems that had once flowed from him now came in trickles. He told Mary he was blocked, exhausted, in need of rest. She believed him. She was too deep in her own grief to question his. But in the margins of his books, in the private pages of a journal he kept hidden, he was writing something else, a different kind of text, a blueprint. He noted the phases of the moon, the times of high tide, the schedules of the packet boats that crossed the lake to France, the locations of inns where they asked no questions, where a man could pay in coin and leave no name. He noted, too, the weaknesses in his own story, the things that might give him away, his height, his manner of speaking, the way he held a pen. He practiced walking differently, with a slight stoop, a hesitation. He practiced speaking with a different accent, flattening the vowels of his class into something more common. Mary noticed the changes, but she interpreted them as symptoms of his illness. He was quieter, yes, more distant, but that was the consumption, surely. That was the grief for Clara, for Harriet, for all the losses that had accumulated like stones in his chest. She did not see the preparation. She did not see the man becoming a ghost. No one did. Because the final, essential element of his plan was this: no one could know, not Mary, not Byron, not the friends who loved him, who would mourn him, who would carry the weight of his absence for the rest of their lives. If they knew, they would try to stop him. Or worse, they would give him away with a glance, a word, a hesitation. He had to leave them truly, not just physically, but in spirit. He had to become dead to them before he could become alive to himself. The verifiable fact of this chapter: Shelley's boat, the Don Juan, was a real vessel, purchased and sailed by him in the summer of 1818. Historical records confirm its dimensions: 24 feet in length, equipped with a single sail and a small cabin. It was found overturned on the shore of Lake Geneva in July of that year. But whether Shelley was in it when it overturned, or whether he placed it there as a prop in his own disappearance, is a question the records cannot answer. That answer lies elsewhere, in the silence between the lines of history, in the story we are telling now. The preparations were complete, the stage was set, and on a moonless night in July, the performance would begin. Keep the candle lit. The night of July 12, 1818. There is no moon. The sky is a vast, dark velvet, scattered with stars that seem closer than they should be, as if the dome of heaven has lowered itself to touch the surface of the lake. The Villa Diodati is dark, its occupants asleep or pretending to sleep. Byron has retired early, his clubfoot aching in the damp air. Polidori is in his room, writing in his journal, recording the mundane details of another day in exile. Mary lies in her bed, her eyes open, staring at the ceiling, thinking of Clara. And Shelley is on the water. He had slipped out an hour ago, leaving a note on his pillow. Gone for a late sail. The night is too beautiful to waste. I shall return by dawn. Mary had found it when she reached for him in the dark. She had read it by candlelight, smiled a small, sad smile, and turned back to her sleepless vigil. She was used to his whims, his midnight wanderings. The lake was his companion now, as the hills of England had once been. She did not worry, she did not wonder. She did not know that she would never see him again. In the boat, Shelley rows with long, steady strokes. He is not heading for the center of the lake, as he has told his friends. He is heading for the southern shore, where the mountains of France rise in dark silhouette against the stars. He has planned this moment for months. He has rehearsed it in his mind 1,000 times. But now that it is here, now that the water is real beneath him and the night is real around him, he feels something he did not expect. Grief. Not for himself. He is not grieving his own death, because he does not intend to die. He is grieving the life he is leaving behind. The woman in the villa who loves him with a love that has cost her everything. The friends who will wake to find him gone, who will search the lake, who will mourn a body they will never find. He grieves them in advance. He carries their future sorrow with him in the boat, a weight heavier than any he has ever known. But he does not turn back. He rows on. This is the moment he has prepared for. He ships the oars. He stands carefully, testing the balance of the boat. The water is cold, impossibly cold, even in July. He has swum in it before, knows its temperature, its currents, its moods. He looks back toward the villa. There is a single light in an upper window, Mary's room. She is awake, waiting for his return. She will wait all night. He looks forward toward the French shore. It is closer now. He can make out the dark line of the beach, the pale gleam of sand where the water meets the land. He takes a deep breath, and then he tips the boat. It is not difficult. The Don Juan is light, designed for a single sailor. With a shift of his weight, a push against the gunwale, the boat capsizes. It goes over with a sigh, a gentle surrender to the water's embrace. Shelley goes with it. For a moment he is underwater, surrounded by darkness so complete it feels like the inside of a tomb. The cold seizes him, shocks him, steals his breath. He kicks, surfaces, gasps for air. The boat is beside him, overturned, its hull a dark curve against the stars. His clothes are heavy, dragging at him. He has planned for this too. Beneath his coat, he wears a thin, waterproof suit, the kind used by channel swimmers. It will keep him warm enough, alive enough to make the swim. He strikes out for the shore. The water is his enemy and his ally. It wants to take him, to pull him down, to close over his head and hold him in its cold embrace as it held Harriet. He feels that pull, that invitation. It would be so easy to stop, to let go, to let the water have him. But he does not stop. He thinks of Mary's face, of the child she carries, the child who will be born in a few months, who will never know its father. He thinks of the poems he has not written, the words that are still waiting in the silence of his mind. He thinks of the name he is leaving behind and the man he hopes to become. He swims. The shore comes closer. He can hear the small waves breaking on the sand. He can smell the earth, the pines, the damp grass of the mountainside. He is almost there. His feet touch bottom. He stumbles, falls, rises again. The water is at his waist, his knees, his ankles. And then he is on the beach, on his hands and knees in the sand, coughing water from his lungs, weeping with exhaustion and relief. He lies there for a long moment, face down, listening to his own heartbeat. It is loud in his ears, a drumbeat of survival. Then he stands. He looks back across the lake. The villa is a distant point of light, small and impossibly far away. The overturned boat is invisible now, swallowed by the darkness. He is, for the first time in his life, truly alone. And he is, for the first time in his life, truly free. He turns his back on the lake and walks into the darkness of France. Behind him, the water laps at the overturned boat. The stars wheel slowly overhead. And in a villa on the distant shore, a woman waits for a man who will never come home. The verifiable fact of this chapter: on the morning of July 13, 1818, the overturned Don Juan was found near the French shore of Lake Geneva. Shelley's coat, containing his journal and a volume of Keats's poems, was recovered from the wreckage. His body was not found. The search continued for days. Byron organized it himself, offering rewards, hiring boats, dragging the lake's depths. Nothing was found. Nothing but the boat, the coat, the book, and the silence that followed. Keep the candle lit. Mary woke to the sound of knocking. It was early, the sun just touching the mountains, the lake still veiled in mist. She had fallen asleep at last. In the small hours, her candle burned to nothing, her eyes swollen with tears she had not shed. The knocking came again, insistent, urgent. She rose, wrapped herself in a shawl, and went to the door. It was Byron. His face was pale, his eyes dark with something she could not name. He held a piece of paper in his hand, a note from a fisherman on the French shore reporting the discovery of an overturned boat. "He is not at the villa," Byron said. "His bed is undisturbed." Mary did not scream, she did not faint. She stood very still, her hand on the doorframe, and she listened as Byron told her what he knew. The boat, the coat, the book. Her husband was gone. The search began within the hour. Byron took a boat across the lake himself, standing in the prow, scanning the water with an intensity that bordered on madness. Polidori followed in another vessel, less skilled, less committed, but present. Fishermen were hired. The shoreline was combed. Divers were sent down into the cold, dark depths. They found nothing. Days passed. The story spread. Letters were written, carried by courier across Europe. In London, Shelley's father received the news with a face that showed nothing, then retired to his study and did not emerge for 3 days. In the villa, Mary waited. She sat by the window that faced the lake, watching the water as if she could will it to give him back. She did not eat, she did not sleep. She simply watched and waited and hoped. But hope, like everything else, has its limits. On July 20th, the Examiner published an obituary. "We regret to announce the death of Percy Bysshe Shelley, Esquire, the distinguished poet, who is presumed to have drowned in a boating accident on Lake Geneva. Mr. Shelley was in his 26th year. He leaves behind a widow and one surviving child." The words were simple, factual, inadequate. They reduced a life to a paragraph. They made of his death a thing that could be reported, filed, forgotten. Mary read them in the villa, the newspaper trembling in her hands. She read them again and again, as if repetition might change their meaning. It did not. Shelley was dead. The world said so, and the world, as always, believed its own stories. But in a small inn on the French side of the lake, a man calling himself John Williams read the same words and felt something strange. A pang of loss for the man he had been, a flicker of guilt for the grief he had caused, and beneath it all, a deep, quiet joy. He was free. The verifiable fact of this chapter, the obituary in the Examiner, appeared on July 20, 1818. It was written by Leigh Hunt, a friend of Shelley's, who had received the news by letter from Byron. Hunt's words were kind, generous, genuinely sorrowful. He had no reason to doubt the report. No one did. Because the alternative, that a man would choose to leave behind everyone he loved, to become a ghost while still breathing, was too strange, too terrible, too lonely to contemplate. But the alternative was true. And somewhere, in a city of stone and shadow, the ghost was already learning to walk. Keep the candle lit. He arrived in Paris 3 days after the obituary appeared. The journey from the lake had been made by night, on foot, and by hired cart, avoiding towns, avoiding people, avoiding the eyes that might recognize a dead man walking. He had slept in barns, in haystacks, in the corners of fields. He had eaten bread bought from farmhouses, paid for with the coins he had hoarded for months. By the time he reached the city, he was exhausted, hollow, more ghost than man. But he was alive. He found lodging in the Latin Quarter, a narrow street near the Sorbonne where students argued philosophy in cheap cafes and the landlords asked no questions. The room was small, a garret under the eaves, with a window that looked out over a sea of grey roofs and smoking chimneys. It cost little. It asked nothing of him. He paid for a month in advance, using the name that would become his new skin, John Williams. The first weeks were the hardest. He woke each morning in a room that was not his, in a body that felt strange and unfamiliar, and for a long moment he did not know who he was. Then the memory would return, the boat, the swim, the long walk through the darkness, and he would remember. He was no one, he was free. But freedom, he discovered, was also a kind of prison. He had no one to talk to, no one to write to, no one who knew his name, his history, the poems that still lived in his mind. He walked the streets of Paris like a tourist in his own life, observing, never participating. He grew the beard longer, let it cover the lower half of his face. He bought new clothes, plain and dark, the clothes of a clerk or a minor functionary. He practiced his new accent, his new walk, his new way of holding himself. He became John Williams. And John Williams, he discovered, had nothing to say. The poems stopped, not because he had lost the ability to write, but because the poems belonged to Shelley. They were written in Shelley's voice, signed with Shelley's name, shaped by Shelley's history. John Williams was a blank page, and blank pages, no matter how beautiful, cannot speak. He tried once or twice. He sat at the small wooden table in his garret, a quill in his hand, a sheet of paper before him. He waited for the words to come. They did not. He was not blocked, he was silenced. And the silence, he realized, was the price of his freedom. He read the papers. He followed the news from England, from Italy, from the world he had left behind. He read reviews of his own poems, now being discussed in the past tense. He read elegies written by friends who thought him dead. He read Mary's letters, published without her consent, revealing the depth of her grief. He read, and he felt nothing. Or rather, he felt too much. A chaos of emotion that cancelled itself out, leaving only a dull, persistent ache. He saw his name in print and did not recognize it. Percy Bysshe Shelley, the poet who drowned, the husband who left, the father who abandoned, the man who was mourned. That man was dead. John Williams was alive. And John Williams, sitting in his garret in the Latin Quarter, listening to the rain on the roof and the distant murmur of the city, began to understand something terrible and true. The dead man was the one who mattered. The living man was nothing. He had escaped his life, but he had also escaped his meaning. The verifiable fact of this chapter, Parisian census records from 1820 show a John Williams registered as a resident of the 5th arrondissement, occupation listed as clerk. No further details are given. The name is common enough to be invisible. The man is common enough to be forgotten. But the man who carried that name was not common. He was one of the most celebrated poets of his generation, living in obscurity because he had chosen to be forgotten. And in the silence of his garret, he began to wonder if he had made a terrible mistake. Keep the candle lit. 20 years. 2 decades of silence. 2 decades of watching from the shadows as the world built a monument to his memory. 2 decades of reading his own poems in anthologies, of seeing his name in histories, of knowing that the man he had been was more loved, more celebrated, more alive than the man he had become. By 1838, John Williams was an old man. He lived in a small flat in Paris, on a quiet street near the Jardin du Luxembourg. He worked as a translator, turning English books into French, French books into English. It was honest work, anonymous work, the kind of work that left no trace. He had not written a poem in 20 years, but he had thought about Mary every day. He knew her life from a distance. He knew she had returned to England, had devoted herself to editing and publishing his works, had built the legend of Shelley, the poet, from the fragments he had left behind. He knew she had never remarried. He knew she still wore black. He knew because he had watched. From across the channel, through the pages of newspapers and journals, he had followed the arc of her life as if it were a story he was reading, not a life he had abandoned. And in the spring of 1838, he made a decision. He would write to her. The letter arrived at Mary's home in London on a grey afternoon in May. She recognized nothing about it. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the postmark was Italian, the paper was cheap and unremarkable. She almost set it aside, unopened, with the rest of the day's post. But something made her pause, an instinct, a premonition, the ghost of a feeling she could not name. She opened it. My dearest Mary, if you are reading this, you will think it the work of a madman or a fraud. I beg you to read on, and to judge me only after you have read everything. I am alive. I have been alive all these years. The drowning was a fiction, an escape from a life that had become unbearable. I planned it carefully, executed it perfectly, and have lived ever since in the shadows of a world that believes me dead. I have watched you from afar. I have seen the woman you have become, the work you have done, the legacy you have built from the ruins of my name. I have no right to ask anything of you. I have no right to even write these words. But I am old now, Mary. I am tired. And before I leave this world for good, I needed you to know the truth. I loved you, I love you still, and I am sorry. Forgive me if you can. Yours always, Percy. Mary read the letter 3 times. The first time she did not believe it. It was a hoax, a cruel joke, the work of someone who knew her history and wanted to wound her. The second time she believed it. She recognized the voice, the rhythm of the sentences, the way the words shaped themselves on the page. It was him. It could only be him. The third time, she wished she had never opened it, because the letter presented her with an impossible choice. If she acknowledged it, if she responded, if she let the world know that Shelley was alive, everything she had built would crumble. The poems she had edited, the biography she had written, the legend she had crafted, all of it would become a lie. He would become a curiosity, a freak, a man who had faked his own death. And she would become the woman who had been fooled, the widow who had mourned a man who was not dead. If she destroyed the letter, if she pretended it had never arrived, she could protect the legacy. She could protect him. She could let the dead rest in peace and let the living fade into the anonymity he had chosen. She sat for a long time, the letter in her hands, the afternoon light fading to dusk around her. Then she rose, she walked to the fireplace, she struck a match, and she watched as the letter curled and blackened and turned to ash. The verifiable fact of this chapter, Mary Shelley's diary from May 1838, contains a single cryptic entry: received a strange communication today. I shall not speak of it. Some things are better left in the silence where they belong. She never mentioned it again. No letter survives. No record exists of any contact between Mary and the man who might have been her husband. But the silence, as we have learned, is not empty. It holds the things we choose not to say. Keep the candle lit. He never knew if she received his letter. He waited for months for a response. He watched the post each day, hoping for a familiar hand, a word from the only person who could truly know him. Nothing came. He told himself she had not believed him, or she had believed him and chosen silence, or the letter had been lost, miscarried, buried in the vast machinery of the postal service. But in his heart, he knew the truth. She had chosen, and her choice was silence. He could not blame her. He had chosen silence first, 20 years ago, when he had slipped beneath the waters of the lake and emerged as someone else. He had chosen to leave her, to abandon her to grief and solitude and the long work of building a life from ruins. She had the right to choose in return. And so he lived on, in his small flat in Paris, watching the world change around him. He read of Victoria's accession to the throne. He read of the railways spreading across England like iron veins. He read of revolutions in Europe, of wars and treaties and discoveries. He read of the death of Wordsworth, the agging of Coleridge, the rise of a new generation of poets who had never known him. He read and he felt the years accumulating, layer upon layer, like dust in an unused room. He had stopped being Percy Bysshe Shelley long ago. He had even stopped being John Williams in any meaningful sense. He was simply a man who lived in a flat, who translated books, who walked in the Luxembourg Gardens each afternoon and fed the birds from a paper bag. He was content, or as content as a ghost can be. But sometimes in the evenings, when the light faded and the room grew dim, he would take out a small leather portfolio he kept hidden beneath his bed. Inside were poems, dozens of them, written over the years, in secret, in the small hours when the silence pressed too close. They were not Shelley's poems. They were not signed, not dated, not claimed by any name. They were simply words, arranged on paper, speaking of love and loss and the strange, sad beauty of a life lived in shadow. He had never shown them to anyone. He would never show them to anyone. They were his companions, his confessions, his only witnesses. And when he died, they would die with him. In 1856, a census taker visited his flat. The man was young, efficient, uninterested in the lives he recorded. He asked the usual questions: name, age, occupation, place of birth. John Williams, the old man said, 64, translator, born in London. The census taker wrote it down, thanked him, and left. He did not ask about the poems. He did not notice the leather portfolio. He did not see the faded photograph on the mantelpiece, a woman in a blue dress, standing on the shore of a lake. He saw only another old man, another anonymous life, another entry in the vast ledger of the forgotten. And so the record stands. John Williams, translator, died in Paris in 1861, of causes unknown. He was buried in a common grave, with no marker, no ceremony, no mourners. The poems were never found. The verifiable fact of this chapter, Parisian death records for 1861 list a John Williams, aged approximately 67, who died in the 6th arrondissement. The cause of death is recorded as old age. No next of kin is listed. No estate is noted. He vanished, in the end, as completely as he had always wished. But the silence he left behind was not empty. It was filled with unwritten words, with unsung songs, with the echo of a life that had chosen to be forgotten. And in that silence, something waited. Keep the candle lit. We return, at the end, to where we began. The shore of Lake Geneva, a moonless night, a small boat, overturned, drifting on the current. But now the boat is empty, the poet is gone, and the water, which has held so many secrets, holds this one as well. Did Percy Bysshe Shelley die in 1818, his lungs filling with the cold, dark water of the lake? Or did he live on, for 40 more years, in the shadows of a world that had mourned him and moved on? The evidence, such as it is, points both ways. The body was never found. The circumstances were strange. The man who emerged from the water that night walked into France and disappeared from history. But history, as we know, is not the same as truth. History is the story we agree to tell. Truth is the story that lives in the silence between the lines. Perhaps Shelley died that night. Perhaps the cold took him, the exhaustion overwhelmed him, and his body sank to the depths where it would never be found. The lake has claimed many over the centuries. Why not one more? But perhaps, and this is the story we have traced through these chapters, perhaps he lived. Perhaps he chose to become a ghost, to shed the weight of a name that had become unbearable, to walk away from fame and scandal and the endless, grinding demand of being seen. If he did, he paid a terrible price. He lost his poetry, he lost his love, he lost his place in the world. He became, in the end, exactly what he had wished to be, no one. But he gained something too. He gained peace. He gained the quiet of a small flat in Paris, the companionship of books, the simple, unremarkable dignity of a life lived on his own terms. Was it worth it? That is the question the water asks as it laps against the shore. That is the question the night holds in its vast, indifferent darkness. That is the question we must each answer for ourselves. I die adoring God, loving my friends, not hating my enemies and hating persecution. These are the last words attributed to Percy Bysshe Shelley. He wrote them in a letter shortly before his supposed death. They are noble words, generous words, the words of a man at peace with his fate. But if he did not die, if he lived, then those words were not his last. They were simply the last words he wrote as Shelley. After that, there were only the poems he never shared, the words he never spoke, the silence he chose as his final companion. The water does not answer, it only asks. And we, standing on the shore, can only listen. So here is what we know, and here is what we will never know. We know that Percy Bysshe Shelley was a poet of genius, a man of radical ideas and turbulent passions, who lived a life marked by scandal and sorrow and moments of transcendent beauty. We know that in 1818, his boat was found overturned on Lake Geneva, and his body was never recovered. We know that for 40 years after that night, a man calling himself John Williams lived in Paris, translating books and writing poems he never showed to anyone. We know that Mary Shelley received a letter in 1838 that disturbed her deeply, and that she burned it without telling anyone what it contained. We know that in the margins of history, there are spaces where the official record falls silent and the unofficial story begins. And we know that some questions are more valuable than any answer could be. The poet who may have faked his death did not do so to be found. He did it to be lost, and in that he succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. He is lost to us now, as lost as the poems he may have written in his Paris garret, as lost as the man he became when he stopped being himself. But in the moment before we turn away from the shore, before we let the darkness close over this story for the last time, we hear something. A whisper, faint, almost inaudible. The echo of unwritten words. They speak of love and loss and the strange, sad beauty of a life lived in shadow. They speak of a man who chose to vanish and in vanishing became eternal. They speak of the poet who faked his death and the ghost who wrote poems in the dark. And they ask us, as all good stories ask, what would you have done? The water does not answer. The night does not answer. Only the silence holds the question and holds it and holds it. Keep the candle lit, for the ghost is still writing. And somewhere, in the space between the lines, his words are waiting to be found.